Coming to you live via recording from Appleton, Wisconsin, it's time for your conservative smackdown. In this corner, your pugilistic pundit, the Duke of Diplomacy, the Professor of Patriotism, the Doctor of Domestic Tranquility.
This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke. I am the aforesaid Dr. Duke, and I'm here with Sparky, our producer. He's behind the camera, and we're going to talk to you today about some really interesting issues. In the news today, of course, is all of this student violence. There are lots of students acting up all over the country every day. The ones that make the news are the African American students. Why? Because whenever there is any reaction to the African Americans acting out, that is further proof of racism in American society. And we begin today with the most famous case at the moment, Spring Valley High School, Columbia, South Carolina. In this situation, you had a young girl who was disruptive in class. She was on her cell phone. She was disturbing the teacher. She was not following along with the lesson plan. She was in her own little world. And despite polite requests and demands from the teacher to put the phone away, to give it up, a vice principal was called in to try to quell the situation. This young girl stubbornly stayed on her cell phone, paid no attention to the authority figures, showed absolute disrespect, not just to the teachers, but to her fellow students who were trying to learn with this disruption. They brought in Officer Deputy Ben Fields, a well-known, well-liked school resource officer. He had worked with these kids a lot. The kids loved him. The administration loved him. He'd been an all-around good cop, had a great career. What happened? As you can see from the video, Ben Fields was forced to physically restrain the girl to bring her into line with what the discipline in the classroom required. She was disruptive. Now, you could debate all you want whether Officer Fields was over the top here. The fact is, as we'll see in a little bit, many of the African American students in this school would support Officer Fields. Well, what happened? Initially, the school demurs, the school is looking into it, but within a couple of days, Officer Fields, Deputy Fields, was fired from his job. He wasn't fired because an investigation determined that he engaged in too much force. He wasn't fired because the internal mechanisms of the school had decided it was too much. He wasn't even fired because parents were demanding he be fired. He was fired because the school did not want to have to deal with what would inevitably come, and what has come anyway. Charges of racism, of cop abuse, of battery against a child, all this nonsense. The student now herself faces misdemeanor charge of disturbing the school. So think about that. The student who triggered all of this with her wanton disobedience, with her disruptive behavior, she's given a misdemeanor charge, and the cop whose job it was to subdue and remove that student, he has now been fired from his job. But this isn't the only time we've seen this. Very recently in Rockdale County High School in Georgia, Conyers, Georgia, we have this particular video where two teenagers involved in a fight on school grounds, and a police officer was forced to use his taser to end the fight quickly. Now that's all you see. All you see on the news media is a cop showing up with two kids wrestling and a taser. It looks horrible, as if this vigilante cop happened to see these two kids playfully roughhousing, pulls his police cruiser over, whips out the taser, evidently because his gun was locked. He couldn't get that to kill them dead, and tases these two kids. But what we know is, at that very same school in Conyers, Georgia, officers had been dispatched for 7 different fights on campus in the previous 2 weeks. A female officer, this gets me, a female officer was pushed to the ground while trying to break up a fight among high school kids, middle school kids. And in the consequence of being pushed to the ground, she actually had kids steal stuff from her. She was robbed while on the ground.
There were a lot of kids around, and our officer went to the ground, and they even stole some equipment off of her person. So, and was slightly injured during the process. So, that's what we're facing day in and day out at the school.
Yeah, that's what we're facing day in and day out at the school. It's the same thing in South Carolina. It's the same thing in Conyers, Georgia. The idea that all of a sudden, once in a blue moon, a child will act up and require this kind of intervention, it's nonsense. It happens every day. It happens all across the country. And the reality is that this is a breakdown of school discipline. This is an absolute breakdown of who's in charge of the classroom. All of this is facilitated, by the way, among others, by the federal government. President Obama using Title IX now as an argument that certain kids are disciplined more than other kids. The argument that the president made recently on TV was, what we have here is a situation where black and Hispanic kids are disciplined at higher rates than non-black and Hispanic kids. Even if that's true, and it's not, but even if that were true, the argument is to dispense with discipline altogether. The argument then is, if that is true, that we relax discipline rules across the board. That doesn't make any sense. That's a recipe for anarchy. Take John F. Kennedy High School in Paterson, New Jersey. A 16-year-old slams a 62-year-old teacher to the floor because that teacher had the temerity to take his phone away during class. The student, in this case, is actually charged with aggravated assault. But the thing that amazes me most about these videos that we're showing you is the teachers themselves don't fight back. The teachers themselves know that if they seek to fight back, or if they seek to restrain students, or if they seek in any way, shape, or form to defend themselves from these attacks, they will be fired. It will be blamed on them. Any radical misbehavior on the part of these kids, they can provoke, they can do any of this stuff, but the minute, whether you're a cop or a teacher, the minute you try to instill discipline, or even the danger now, teachers are increasingly being encouraged not to separate kids who are fighting, because you'll get dragged into it, and you will always be held accountable if you're a cop or a teacher. But ironically, you're seldom held accountable to the same degree if you're a student. Take Aldine Nimitz High School in Houston, Texas. A 325-pound 16-year-old student shoves a 66-year-old teacher to the ground after she took his phone during class. That's a pretty shocking piece of video. A passive teacher, arms at the side, pushed to the ground, almost punched to the ground by an intimidating physical presence. Can't fight back. The student itself was charged with injury to the elderly. Now, why isn't this battery? Why isn't this something much more significant? This is injury to the elderly. You can see how, when kids engage in this kind of behavior, they provoke it, they encourage it, and the minute it's done, the schools and teachers and racial groups rally around this as proof of violence against children, of proof of singling out of African American kids or Hispanic kids for punishment that is not unilaterally applied to every kid. Chicago Vocation, one of my favorites, just came out. This is 5 years old. From the Chicago Vocational Career Academy back in 2011. Take a look at this video. He picks up a chair and approaches her, has to be restrained from hitting her with the chair, threatens her, intimidates her, bullies her. Over and over again, the teacher is heard multiple times to be asking for somebody to go get security. None of the students help. None of the students get security. Right? This is not just white teachers and white cops dealing unfairly with innocent African American kids. This is an epidemic. In an ironic twist, and I always like to point out, kids are like puppies. Kids are like puppies in the sense that they need boundaries. And if you don't give a puppy boundaries, it's going to act out. It's the same thing with our kids. And our kids, they're really smarter than we give them credit for. When you create this kind of anarchy in schools, where teachers and even police officers are terrified of getting involved in fights, in mediating between upset students, when students feel they have the ability to body slam principals, to threaten elderly teachers, to knock them to the ground, and how many of these incidents deal with cell phones? What kind of a system is it when we allow kids in class to be using cell phones to distract other kids and themselves from their learning? In an ironic twist, kids are like puppies, like we said. These kids in South Carolina, they supported African-American kids. They supported the police officer. Going back to the South Carolina incident involving Deputy Fields, right? A few days after the incident, students all across the school marched out in protest in support of the officer. You see their hashtag #BringBackFields, right? These are kids who really do want to learn, who did not appreciate the disruption in class. These are kids who were not distracted by their cell phones. And these are also kids who have enough of a moral center and a compass not to blame the law enforcement agents, not to blame teachers for trying to instill respect and decency in schools. And what do we take away from this? Besides the fact that kids are puppies, and that if you don't give them boundaries, like you don't give puppies boundaries, they're going to act up. They're going to metaphorically pee all over everything. What they really need is a strong hand. And we are doing African American kids, Hispanic kids, we are doing kids in general no favors by throwing away boundaries, by dispensing with discipline in the name of social justice. What we need, President Obama, is not a school system that de-emphasizes discipline in the name of equality and social justice. We need school systems to ratchet up control. We need teachers to have the ability to take charge. We need to be able to remove rowdy, inattentive, disruptive students by any means necessary. And if that means dragging them out of their chairs by cops when they won't listen, then it needs to be done.
Do you have a question or comment you'd like Dr. Duke to respond to? Email the show at media@fpeusa.org.
And now it's time for our knockout round. Well, not surprisingly, after the episode in South Carolina, where a young African-American female student was dragged out of her chair by a cop, all those other examples of kids acting out in school that were either tasered or removed, kids bullying teachers, 325-pound high school boys knocking down 66-year-old teachers. Predictably, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan comes out. A few days following the incident in South Carolina, he said, quote, "This week we've been forced again to confront how far we still have to go in the struggle for true equality." Well, of course, Arne plays the race card. We're forced to confront how far we have to go in the struggle for equality. If we want to maintain the trust of parents and communities in our schools, we must start treating our children with respect and dignity. Well, the way I always learned it is that you get what you deserve. Right? That children earn respect. It's not afforded to them. And if children are disrespecting their elders, children are disrespecting their fellow students, if children are disrespecting their teachers, if children can look cops in the eyes and sneer and ignore their orders, then we don't have any discipline, then we don't have any equality, then we don't have any justice. And I guarantee you that the vast majority of American parents, black, white, Hispanic, or otherwise not named Arne Duncan, recognize the need that without a basic tenet of respect, without discipline, there can be no learning in classrooms. Arne Duncan demonstrated for his 7 years at the Department of Education, he was much more interested in social justice than he was in education. He was not interested in improving American schools. He was very interested, however, in sociologically engineering the way the schools were run, how they were tested, who was in control of those schools. Typical liberal power broker, completely off base when it comes to solutions. Speaking of typical loony liberal power brokers, take a look at this Fox face-off between a host and famous radical activist Quanell X. Take a listen to this.
Now, I do agree the cop went too far, but I don't think he should have lost his job over it. I think it's high time we start addressing the root causes of all this, the disrespect of teachers, this Black Lives Matter movement, this perpetual chip on your shoulder against everybody that's not like yourself. It's got to stop. We've got to address the culture.
Let's deal with the culture of these crazy fanatic white boys who go in schools with guns and shoot and kill everybody. Let me finish.
I'm gonna
Hold on. Wait a minute. Columbine, killing the kids at the elementary school, the shootings in other cities across America have all been crazy little white boys shooting up innocent people. So let's study that culture.
Okay, Mr. Quanell, Mr. X, you're trying to suggest to us that all these high school shootings have not been looked at, that we have not spent any time at all deconstructing crazy little white boys, if we want to get all racial on this, that we've spent no time as a culture deconstructing these issues. Have you not been paying attention, Mr. X? Gun control, radical gun control initiatives coming from the White House, all because kids are shooting up high schools. All this stuff, all these cultural things that are beginning to happen now in the wake of these shootings. You have all of the invention of the term white privilege is in some respects a mark, a reaction against these shootings. We have hyper-analyzed these crazy little white kids. But if you want to play that game, Mr. X, when the host asks you about why so many of these kids who are reacting this way, who are bullying teachers, knocking them down, threatening them with elevated chairs, why so many of those kids happen to be African American, your response is, let's look at the crazy white boy. Well, let's play that game then, Mr. X. Because the vast majority of black violence against black people, is perpetrated by other blacks. By your very argument, if that's what we need to be looking at, given that when you step outside the schools and look at the broader incidences of black violence, most of it is perpetrated by other black people. Should we be examining that culture? I will do you the service, Mr. Quanell X. I will not call that crazy black culture, because I'm not racist and you're not going to accuse me of it. I couldn't get away with the nonsense you get away with. Try being intellectually consistent from time to time. It makes a big difference. But then again, maybe you would have had to learn that in the schools, and the kind of schools you're modeling for us, Quanell, they're never going to get you there. And that's our knockout.
Don't miss a second of Dr. Duke. Visit FreedomProject.com and sign up for our free newsletter. Like us on Facebook or follow us in the Twitterverse. All the links can be found at FreedomProject.com.